On Truth, and Why Modern Talk of Relativism is Evil, Suicidal Nonsense, by Tony V.C. Lowe, read by the author. 2 + 2 = 4. Truth exists. It's the fact of facts, the proof of proofs, the fundamental foundation of all of our endeavours to inquire, to explore, to learn, to discuss, to discern, to think, and to map out the nature of reality. The idea that this claim should need to be stated is insane, but clearly, in the age in which we live, the existence of truth and the existence of sanity are not one and the same thing. It has moved radical skepticism into the realm of the ridiculous, and upon such a radical skepticism we might ask, but how can we know that the truth exists? The answer to which is that the proof lies in the very question. After all, to so much as challenge the existence of truth is to imply a search for it. To ask, does the truth exist, is to ask, is it true that the truth exists? And if the question is to have any meaning, we have to answer, of course it does. Even a denial of truth is a direct proof of it. After all, consider the claim, truth does not exist. The question, of course, must be, is this true? If it is true, then something is true, and therefore truth does exist. If it is not true, then the claim is denied, and hence, truth does in fact exist. And so, truth is undeniable. Yet, upon our modern thrust of confusion, we seem to have been tempted to draw away from this fact, and if it cannot be abolished, attempts have at least been made to deny it, to avoid it, to weave a way around it until we can find another way to rest on our own fractured nonsense. Many will admit, for example, that truth exists. Sure, of course truth exists. There is this truth and that truth, your truth and my truth, but there isn't the truth. No, that still needs to be denied. Surely things are true, but the idea that there is a consistent truth that rests beneath all errors and opinions, surely that's going a bit too far. The problem with this argument is that it first denies the facts and again falls under its own weight. It falls under its own weight because the very claim that truth is only subjective and changes from person to person is itself framed as something which is objectively true, that accurately describes reality for everyone. Truth is always subjective, therefore it is objectively subjective. Therefore, this is a claim which is objectively true. Beyond the bounds of this logical loop, we can see that truth has an objective reality. There are so many truths or claims that simply do not change. 2 + 2 = 4, for example. This is true for everyone, everywhere, at all times, and in all places. A sophist might try to deny this by trying to say that we have not always used language in the same way. The Romans may have simply used the numerals IV, and so hasn't truth changed? No, because to change a word is not to change the reality behind it. For all the complex nuances of language and its relation to thought, 2 men stood with 2 men makes a group of 4. If a poor man has 2 coins in one hand and 2 in the other, no amount of redefining and opinion shifting will fashion him with 5. And if he does by some miracle open his palms to find 5, it will be because 1 has been added to 4, not because 4 has suddenly become something that it is not. It is for this reason that 2 + 2 = 4 has become a kind of herald of objective truth, the inscription on its coat of arms. It is one link among many to a reality that, despite the shifting sands of circumstance and time, remains solid beneath our feet. It is something concrete. Yet it is not the only concrete thing that speaks of solid ground. Concrete walls, for example, are sure signs of objective reality. It is interesting to consider how many dyed-in-the-wool subjectivists would charge headlong into one. It is interesting to consider why the supposedly godlike power of opinion is so feeble that it stops us short at walls, or the need to eat food, or fails to shield us unscathed when we walk into a roaring flame. That is what 2 + 2 = 4 heralds, that there is a solid reality, and not only is it solid, but there is a particular scope of activity which can be done within it. Now, it's a very large scope. In fact, it encompasses all things that can possibly be done, but it does not stray into the impossible. It demands only that reality be itself, and as guests within reality, it would have us act accordingly. Although it has been very generous with this condition, it has allowed us to do no more and no less than every good, true, and beautiful thing that mankind has done or will ever do. It is only the depths of pride and the heights of hubris that demand that it should be otherwise, that demand that we may enjoy a sunrise so long as the circular sun can at once be square, that demands that we may be free to choose good or to choose evil, and then demand that good and evil ought to be one and the same thing. And then to the final charge against the claim. The charge that 2 + 2 = 4 is so horrible and so grey that if we are to embrace it, we are to condemn ourselves to a world of heartless facts and numbers. As if by accepting that the foundations of reality are as strong as concrete, we at once render reality as grey and as coarse as concrete, and rob it of all life, surprise, and wonder. But this simply isn't so. We can first consider how many men can recognise that up is up and down is down, yet wonder both at what lies beneath them and what stands above them. To accept that one man and one woman makes two makes the marriage of two souls no less enchanting. In fact, it guards its enchantment and beauty by saving it from the jaws of confused insanity. It is just so with music. The classical conception of music has given it clear and ordered parameters, separating notes into octaves and dividing clear steps and half steps between them. But from these small and defined parameters, we have in our hands an infinite variety of song. Every gradation of mood and colour can be explored in that simple set. Yet it would be accused of being too constrained. 2 + 2 = 4 allows for far greater scope than the rules of music, as it is upon the same spirit of this universal law that trees are green. And that's not because trees are green because 2 + 2 = 4, but because the greenness of trees and the measure of 4 follow the same universal law, that things are themselves, that reality is consistent with itself. And in one facet of reality we can map the laws of arithmetic, and in another facet we perceive the fragrance of love and the greenness of trees. 2 + 2 = 4 is simply pro-reality. 2 + 2 = 5 or any other nonsense is simply anti-reality. And to be pro-reality is to be in favour of what is and what can be, in particular all that can be good, true, and beautiful. To be anti-reality is to veer hard against them. The remaining task of this book is to explore these major claims in some of their aspects. There is more to say about making decisions and running into walls. There is much to address about the complexity of truth and its consistency, despite its complexity. There is emphasis to be given to why relativism and denial of objective truth is not only nonsense, but evil and suicidal. And of course, there is much to wrestle with in the battleground of language, where the tipping point between our clarity and confusion so often seems to reside. Yet, when all is said, we will see that a solid conception of truth is something that must be fought for. The General Zeitgeist. Zeitgeist is the general spirit or mood of the age, and when it comes to the question of truth, it is worth giving some sketch of what the general prevailing attitude tends to be. It would appear that in the West the prevalent spirit resides in a kind of schizophrenic halfway house between the embrace of truth and a radical relativism. Some assent to truth seems to be automatic by proxy. For someone who never considers the matter, they have to accept that objective truth exists on some level to navigate through daily life. A carpenter has to believe in an objective reality that determines quantity and the strength of his materials. Without a single lesson in epistemology, he would be perplexed, if not mortified, should a client insist that, in their opinion, timber was no better a building material than mayonnaise. Even the most ambitious spin doctors and advertisers who live by lies and manipulation have to believe in the truth that people can and will be persuaded or deceived. Not to mention the myriad of little instances throughout the day when we consent to the objective reality of food, or mortality, or taxes. Yet, if the intellect is pressed to consider and defend the concept of truth, things begin to become a bit shaky. The general response that people fall back on is that, well, people are just free to believe whatever they want to. Or, if you have a bit of a university education, people are not only free to believe what they want, but truth actually changes from person to person. And so there is no such thing as truth, don't you see, you naive bigot? The irony, of course, is that these same people will insist that the idea is indeed true and that everyone ought to accept it. The logic or anti-logic of the modern zeitgeist directly flows from the three pillars of modern ideology: hedonism, liberalism, and relativism. These three principles are so intimately connected because they are three gradations of the same principle: prideful self-gratification. And we will see that all three are fundamentally flawed. Hedonism is self-gratification applied to ethics. The idea that the maximization of personal enjoyment and satisfaction is the primary goal in life. If you ask someone, ultimately, what is the meaning of life? What is your goal? And they say, well, at the end of the day, I want to feel good. I just want to be happy. This is hedonism. And in modern, secular, nihilist society, it is the default ethical ideology, and in fact it means making ethics in the image of each person. Liberalism is hedonism applied to politics. It's basically a quiet consent to the idea that, well, we all want to enjoy ourselves as much as possible, but we all want to do that in different ways, and so we are going to try and form a society that allows us to. It is self-gratification with the inevitable necessity of mutual compromise. You might protest that we are somehow post-liberal or non-liberal, and that ideologies such as capitalism or communism are more representative of the modern age. But I put it to you that even these are variations on the same themes and different proposals for attaining the same end. For all the differences between capitalists and communists, their arguments still rest on the promise of materially gratifying as many individuals as possible. Just as hedonism seeks to form ethics in the image of each individual, we could say that liberalism proposes to form politics in the image of each individual, or each individual ideology. That is why we are told that all religions and peoples can live together in liberal society, so long as the Christians are liberal Christians, or Muslims are liberal Muslims. The irony, of course, being that every ideology is welcomed with open arms with the promise that it can be itself, on the one condition that it does not remain itself and become something liberal. Liberalism framed in this way might be the most explicit part of the modern zeitgeist, because whereas hedonism is more implicit and automatic, liberalism is more explicit and expressed more openly on the societal stage. It is the same thing that leads so many people to recognize a difference between true and false, yet claim that no culture, nor religion, nor philosophy is, at heart, any more true than another, despite the fact that no cultures have ever taught this, and all the while quietly assuming that liberalism is the truest idea of them all. Relativism is hedonism applied to philosophy. We could either regard it as the intellectual origin or the intellectual conclusion of hedonism. After all, if self-gratification is the goal, one indelible thing that stands before the gratification of all of our desires is the idea that there is a reality that does not bend to them. Instead, then, better to consider a reality that changes based on the dreams and fancies of each individual. Even as groups come together, if one society wants to hoist its banner high and acclaim in a loud ecstasy of freedom that 2 + 2 equals yellow zebras, and another acclaims that all men can live as blue walruses on the surface of the sun, truth shifts as freely as the words that pronounce it, in a melange of truthful non-truth, with the silent contract that, well, I won't challenge your nonsense, so long as you leave me to mine. As long as gratification is the measure of value, all value, including the value of our ideas, all ideas are on the table, and become a veritable buffet for a gluttonous epistemology to feed from. Hence, value, politics, and truth are all shaped in the form of man's self-centered desire. This seems to be the general lay of the modern globalist Western zeitgeist, and although many paths branch off and even away from it, the main avenue stretches on. The key problem is that the entire thing is a lie. The idea that man defaults to his own selfish desires may well be a truism, but that he should do such a thing has hardly been settled as true. Indeed, many of the most noteworthy philosophies throughout time and space have recognized the invariable contradiction inherent in this view, and have seen that man becomes more, not less, miserable when he seeks the desires of himself. Indeed, if we take it as far as relativism, we will see that it puts us at odds with reality itself, and, by extension, our ability to live within it. Although, if hedonism remained in the selfish heart and stayed there, perhaps there would be little to say on the matter. But as far as it reaches into liberalism, it causes more confusion still. Liberalism is a confused and contradictory ideology by its very nature, which at once tries to get everyone to live together in a shared way, whilst trying to unite contradictory and incompatible ways of living. Whether your culture is traditionally patriarchal or feminist is one thing, but it cannot be traditionally patriarchal and feminist at the same time. One ideology must take primacy. One must give way to the other. One must soften or be swept along. They cannot all be free to be what they are. Multiculturalism is an oxymoron. Either there are separate and distinct cultures, or they are made chimeric, blending different features, though sharing the heart and body of one. That is the lie of liberalism, that it dresses itself up as many cultures, yet, at heart, it is only one. Finally, there is the lie of relativism, but in a sense that will be the subject of the rest of this book. For now it has been enough to consider the modern zeitgeist and the general lay of things. Our desire is centered inwards, selfwards, and tends to pull all things into it. It's a tale as old as time, but still, it's the way that things seem to be. What I have described is an abstract, philosophical, or even spiritual phenomenon at the heart of our society, but in our day-to-day interactions, or even within the halls of academia, we see its mark upon the mind of modern man. It is the same set of ideas that lead a man to revere truth in the workplace, so long as it allows him to build houses, but leaves it at the door if it has anything more to say to him at home. And in academia, well, there seems to be a veritable war against truth, with students and faculties alike leading their much acclaimed avant-garde into the frontier, to head truth off at the pass, with all of the mental work that the common man is not willing, nor interested, nor able to use, all the while stealing something right from beneath his feet. That seems to be the lay of it, the big picture, the general sweep. But I am well aware that this broad brush does not cover a grey and uniform canvas. The zeitgeist may only reflect the majority, or perhaps not even that, but only the loudest and most public ideas amongst the majority. Either way, it does not follow that the world has completely given up on truth. Scores of people recognize it, and if not knowing it, want to pursue it, and if knowing it, want to uphold it. I believe that the value of truth for mankind is so basic and instinctual that even as one half of our hearts struggle against it and we start to mobilize our intellect in contravention, another part hesitates, stops still, stands and waits, knowing full well that the truth has something more important to say to us, all of us, than we might be ready to hear. That it might be worth listening, if we would only be willing. Reality, decisions, and brick walls. As was shown in the first chapter, the existence of objective truth is proven by logical necessity. The very arguments that would deny its existence collapse under their own weight. That is the first clear way to demonstrate objective truth. The second clear way is to point out that activity has limits, and this has also been alluded to already. How do we know that objective truth exists? Because we cannot do whatever we want whenever we please. This is not just a legal reality dependent upon man-made laws. There are clearly rules and parameters set by reality itself that determine what we can and can't do. And when we try to, it's like running headfirst into a brick wall. If a man limps into a hospital with a broken leg, there might be many ways to fix it, but we will not fix it by sprinkling his leg with cheese. You can build a house out of many things. You can even build a house out of ice. But you cannot build it out of ice open to the scorching heat of the desert, not if you want to try and sleep in it. The plethora of practical limits is so vast and so obvious, is it even worth referring to? Worth referring to, perhaps, and only for this reason: to emphasize that a denial of objective truth puts us at odds with reality, and this has practical consequences. As I explained in my previous book, Life and Truth, there is an intrinsic link between our ability to apprehend truth and our ability to navigate reality. And given that truth is that which accords with reality, and given that reality sets the bounds of possibility, the more we appreciate truth and are guided by it, the more we will be able to make effective decisions based upon what is possible. Indeed, this is the reason why relativism is to be called suicidal, but more on that soon. Yet why this insistence on objective truth again? Why can't we be guided by relative or subjective truth? Because it is a complete misnomer, a misdirection, something that fogs the lighthouse and spills ink on the map. After all, relativism doesn't hold that we perceive the same objective truth in different ways, but that the very truth, and, by extension, the very nature of reality changes from person to person. The response is, put that into practice. Try and live that way. Run the experiment and charge 100 men at a 10-meter thick wall and see how many pass through it. Place another 100 men at the center of a nuclear blast and see how many come back to give you the results. Just remember to tell them to think the bomb out of existence before it explodes. Human life allows for great variation, but that does not make it relative. Every culture around the world has found different ways of building houses, for example. Each and every culture has developed different cuisines and ways of farming. Yet there isn't a single house that has defied the laws of physics, nor a single culture that never needed to eat. Every human life is unique, but look around you and you will find that despite our differences, there is a sense in which we are all playing by the same rules. We have found our own way to navigate our parts of reality, but we are clearly in a shared universe, a shared reality. And again, the key thing, that it sets its parameters for us. We do not, by our own opinions, change the nature of it. A man with no money will admit that his bank does not fill with gold just because he has the opinion that it does. And finally, anyone who has ever worked with materials will tell you that if a piece of metal has to fit a 20-centimeter gap, and the metal is cut to 15 centimeters, it will not fit the gap. No way, no how. No force of will, nor opinion, nor argument, nor any kind of fancy rhetorical wordplay will make the non-existent centimeters cross the gap. Reality itself has dictated so, and now the work has to be fixed or to be done again. But I think the point has been made. The task now is to consider why the point is so important, because it forces us to consider the consequences if we do not accept these facts about reality. The reason that relativism is suicidal is because it tries to deny the objective rules of reality, and hence puts us at odds with them. By doing so, we are not working with reality, but rather with non-reality, with non-existence. Let's bring this back from the abstract. A man is required to build a bridge across a river to cover a 20-meter distance. Being a relativist, he redefines 20 meters as 10 meters, and builds his 10-meter bridge. Yet, of course, the bridge juts over the river, into the middle, but does not reach the other side. The man insists that 10 is as much as 20, or even as much as 40, but the size of the river remains what it is, and until he accepts that, it is impossible for him to reach the other side. This example may seem trivial. Surely it is far from suicidal when we fail to build a bridge. But we must consider the cascade of consequences that result from a consistent application of the same principle. A man redefines numbers and cannot build a bridge. What if he redefines food? What if he redefines toxins as nutrition? What if he thinks away the concept of nourishment? What if man relativizes not only bridges, but houses and schools and hospitals? What would happen to all of our roads and transport if the very idea of distance was arbitrarily defined? Is it not clear that if such a society were completely relativized, it would become a chaotic cavalcade of a dysfunctional mess? It should be clear to anyone that a society built upon a genuine relativism would collapse under its own weight, and for very good reason. Because, as we have already seen, the very idea of relativism collapses under its own weight. That is why relativism is suicidal. It is self-destructive. I believe that we are seeing elements of this now. It appears that cultures are apprehensive about embracing an explicit and genuine relativism because the knowledge remains that we can't function that way. Yet it appears that we are trying to see how much of the poison we can drink without it becoming fatal. Consider the modern issue of the relativization of identity. This recent insanity has been bubbling away for some time, but has exploded onto the scene in recent years. The idea that everything from sex, to race, to your status as being disabled, or even becoming a wolf or a chicken are all up for grabs, and the notion that this is at once good and sane are being pushed on the level of social dogma. Another irony of liberalism. Now, you don't need to have a degree in philosophy to recognize that there are clear, real dividing lines between men and women, or that Caucasian races and African races are not one and the same thing. Even if the gradations between races are vague or mixed, and a man is half African and half Caucasian, it doesn't follow that he can suddenly flip this reality and become half Mexican and half Chinese the next day, with all the biological markers that come with it. Nor does a man, by force of will, become a chicken. He may act like a chicken, by some grotesque artifice he may even look like a chicken, but as he clucks and squawks, covered in feathers, he is a man. A deluded, degraded man. And so, identity isn't arbitrary. There are objective parameters that lie beneath it. But what if we reject that? What if culture took this identity shifting to its logical conclusion? If identity is purely based on the idea, then why cannot every man declare by force of conviction that he is the Prime Minister? Indeed, why not solve poverty by telling every beggar to identify as rich? What, in a purely relativistic society, would be the problem with allowing anyone who took the fancy to stroll into a hospital and declare that they are the head surgeon, ready to carry out procedures? Because it is so obviously suicidal to relativize the parts of our identity that deal with competency and skill. If a man is a bus driver, then being a bus driver is part of his identity, but without the qualifications, he cannot suddenly re-identify himself as a surgeon. Why not have a society in which each person wears 20 different hats, and each day as he leaves the door he decides to be a surgeon, or a bus driver, or a police officer, or a priest, or a scientist, or whatever else he is in the mood for after breakfast? If society relativizes the identity of competence, it is obviously suicidal. Yet, competence is arguably far more arbitrary than sex, race, or species, although we think that relativizing these things will have no consequences. But let's tie this back to the level of the individual. Consider the state of his decisions if a man tries to live like he is a chicken. You have to consider for a moment the difference between a man who tries to act like a chicken and a man who generally tries to be a chicken in the most literal sense. Of course, for a man to act like a chicken is tickety-boo. Eccentric in the street, maybe, acceptable on the stage, but reality doesn't stop a man from wearing a feather suit and flapping his arms. His decisions can reach their end. However, the man who decides to be a genuine chicken, a flapping of the arms and a feather suit might be as far as he gets. We find that beyond that, his decisions hit a brick wall. If he dedicates his whole life to it, furiously building more and more elaborate suits, or fashioning fancy cardboard eggs, perhaps even beyond that he decides to dedicate his life to the Frankenstein experiments, in which he splices parts of his genes with chicken DNA, so that he can become some half-chicken abomination. Alas, even then, the man will still find that he cannot truly be a chicken. And after the long pains of his efforts, he will find that they are all ultimately in vain. That is the other sense in which relativism is suicidal. Because if we accept nonsense and try to live by it, it kills the effectiveness of our decisions, and steals from us our time, leading us to pursue things that we not only ought not, but simply cannot do. Hence, it is better to live by truth. When we recognize truth clearly, objectively, and consistently, it frees our path into the avenues of possibility. It is, in reality, the real liberating factor in life that allows us to pursue our goals and realize our aims. Relativism puts a bird in a cage and tells it to fly. Objective truth sets a man on a road and invites him to walk. Complex does not mean subjective. If anyone has come this far with any favour towards relativism, there may well be the lingering issue of sheer complexity. After all, this is the most common wedge which is driven by the relativist argument. Life is complicated. Things change. There is so much to see from so many different perspectives, and, After all, given the infinite variety of perspectives, who is anyone to say that one is really right or wrong? This is the kind of question that moves us from the establishment of clear boundaries to a wider epistemology. You see, the only fact that is perhaps more obvious than the existence of truth is the fact that truth is complicated. However, the claim is this, that the complexity of the truth and subjectivity are not the same thing. There is a world of difference between positing a reality that changes its very nature from person to person and positing an objective reality that we perceive in a variety of ways. The point to make is that what is so often taken as proof of a relativistic, subjective reality is in fact proof of an objective, complex reality seen from different points of view. Consider this example. A man stands next to a tower and it looks very big. A person stands miles away from it and it looks very small. One says that it is big, the other says that it is small. True enough, big and small are relative terms. Yet here's the thing. What size is it? The answer is that the tower is exactly the size that it is. Measured from base to zenith, it is 100 meters tall. And so is it big or is it small? Perhaps it is hard to say. Perhaps we can say that it looks big if we stand close to it, and it looks small if we stand far away from it. Yet we can still conclude that however big it is bigger than 10 meters and smaller than 1,000. Even if we look at the shift in perspective, sure enough there is a change from big to small as we get closer or further away. But instead of relativizing the situation, we reveal a consistent, dare we say objective, pattern. That the appearance of the tower shrinks as a person moves further away from it. Hence, 10 men stood at 10 different distances would see the tower at 10 different scales. Yet the same pattern of reality is applying to all of them, whilst the actual size of the tower remains the same. The truth isn't relative, it's just complex. What we really see here is an objective principle giving rise to mixed and even relative variations. That's why we can say that many things are relative. Positions can be relative, perceptions can be relative, but this does not show that truth is, ultimately, relative. The concept of subjectivity also has meaning. After all, one man enjoys chocolate, another enjoys vanilla. Thus the claim, vanilla tastes good, is rendered subjective because it depends on the tastes of each individual. Yet the admission that some elements of reality are held within the confines of one's preferences doesn't mean that those confines are broken by default, and that the subjective and objective realms are one and the same. In a sense, the admission is not even truly relative. There are two subjective realities contained within a larger reality. Vanilla tastes good is subjective, changing its truth status from one person to another. But the claim that some people like the taste of vanilla and some don't is an objective truth about a reality which applies to all. Hence, we see the same pattern. A complex reality as viewed by each person giving the impression of something which might be relative, but seen from a broader view, we see that this complex reality is objective, with subjective perceptions occurring within it. This is nothing new. The whole edifice of the scientific method, for example, is based at once upon the idea that consistent, repeated patterns can be found within reality, and that we should approach our study in such a way as to try to remove subjective opinion from the study. The very idea that we have discourses or arguments or standards in tests is based on the notion that there is a difference between whatever you happen to think and what is true. The capacity for mistakes or even lies doesn't support the relativist idea either. If the response is that scientists, as just one example, can be wrong or can collect their data in the wrong way, or even that they change their theories, the response is, yes, but there is a difference between individual mistakes and a standard of improvement. The very idea of a mistake implies a standard that was missed. The issue is not whether a scientist always collects data in the perfect way, but whether such a scientist who did collect data perfectly and consistently would be better than one who didn't. If we continue with the example of science, there is the idea that a paradigm shift either does or at least ought to account for more data than the one that came before it. The entire model of the physical universe might seem to change, but if the new model can account for more data, form more consistent theories, and make more robust predictions than the one that came before it, it is a better model. It's a way of saying that it is a model that maps onto the objective reality more accurately than the one before. Even if the development isn't progressive and our general paradigms of science slip into models that are less consistent and less predictive as time rolls on, this does not prove relativism, but only leads to the conclusion that, judged against objective reality, these models are worse than the ones that came before them. It is this notion of better or worse that serves as another proof of objectivity, and is why, despite all of the knee-jerk claims to the contrary, objectivity is just as applicable to morality as it is to science. Once relativists give ground over to the objectivity of mathematics or the physical sciences, their second line of defense is the common assertion that there might be objective facts, but there is no such thing as objective value. They will say that morality is, by definition, subjective, but the exact opposite is true. If morality is to mean anything, it must be objective. Morality, by its very nature, entails that some decisions that we make are better or worse than others. If we apply this to our interactions with other people, a relativist conception of morality removes any sense of morality between us. One man chooses to murder you in cold blood. Under your conception, it is bad, but under his conception, it is good. Therefore, it is not really good if he refrains from killing you, and not really bad if he does. There is no common objective standard for you to appeal to. There is no standard beyond your opinion or his that the man moves away from if he commits murder, or moves closer towards if he lives a full life of love and charity. The measure of morality goes as far as your own head, and that's it. Perhaps, at times, that same morality seems to be shared in the heads of other people, giving it the semblance of something consistent. But the relativist sees that this is simply an illusion, and that the 1,000 people who don't like murder are just as right or just as wrong as the one person who loves it. And so the idea that we have to live in a way that is moral towards each other is a sentiment, but from a rational point of view, it is completely devoid of sense. However, you might say that morality remains truly relative, indeed, within the confines of our own heads. But even there, it is rendered meaningless. After all, we posit morality as a standard by which we judge decisions and actions to be better or worse. Yet if there's no standard beyond ourselves and it is we ourselves who are the measures of morality, then why would you ever change the action? Why not just change the standard? You might think that a man who invents his own morality would pursue nobler things such as loving sacrifice, charity and gratitude, instead of being base, hateful, capricious and lazy. Yet, these are only subjective realities. Noble is only a relative term with no fixed meaning, and so if he finds it easier and more enjoyable, why not just redefine a good and noble man as one who is hateful and lazy? Relative morality shifts on the grounds of each person's preferences, but if there is no morality which is fixed beyond each person's preferences, then morality and preference are one and the same thing. The individual man is no longer better or worse depending on his decisions, because he can always redefine himself as perfect, whoever or whatever he happens to be. If we are relativists who want to be perfectly moral, the rational thing is not to posit a form of morality that sits beyond all of our actions and preferences, which they might fall short of. The rational thing is to invent a form of morality which matches exactly with whatever we happen to do. Hence, even when we consider the individual, moral relativism leaves morality devoid of all sense of purpose and meaning. Morality must be objective, because this is the only kind of morality that makes any kind of sense. Then we come on to paradox. From oddities within quantum physics to clever puzzles invented by the ancient Greeks, paradoxes could be used in the case for relativism with the claim that they show objective reality to be contradictory, or that our powers of comprehension are ultimately limited. As to the second claim, we should note that this is no proof because to posit an objective reality is in no way to posit that we can understand such a reality in its entirety, but more on that later. As for the first claim, this too shows a difference between objective reality and our ability to grasp it accurately and correctly, because apparent contradictions and genuine contradictions are not the same thing. After all, paradoxes are defined as, quote, a seemingly absurd or contradictory statement or proposition which, when investigated, may prove to be well-founded or true. A chapter was dedicated to this topic in Life and Truth, but one of the examples is worth reusing here. There is a shape which is floating in the air. From beneath it, a man sees a square, yet from the side, another man sees a triangle. And so the same shape appears to at once be a square and a triangle. But that's not possible because a square cannot be a triangle. What's going on? The answer is that the shape is a pyramid, with a square on one face and triangles on all others. True enough, when we are confined to 2 dimensions, squares cannot be triangles, and indeed squares are never triangles. But in 3 dimensions, we can see shapes which are partially square and partially triangular. A relativist might jump to the conclusion that the apparent contradiction shows that the shape changes its very nature depending on the person looking at it. But when we solve this paradox, we find that in objective reality more fully conceived, there is but one shape that seemed to be contradictory until we improved our understanding. This is a simple example of paradox, and there are more complex ones to consider, but they all follow the same theme. Complexity giving way to apparent contradiction, giving way to objectivity. The only other thing to consider is that some paradoxes have not been solved yet, and some might remain unsolved forever, but this doesn't prove relativism either. The final thing to consider then is the question of doubt. Isn't relativism true because we're not omniscient? None of us understand things perfectly, and at the end of the day, it's always possible for us to be wrong. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the response is, once again, no. In fact, this kind of leap from doubt to relativism is at once ironic and illogical. Much like with morality, the general idea of investigating truth posits a standard that might make one idea better or worse, i.e. closer or further from the truth than another. The acceptance that we might always have some doubt is the admission that no matter how close we get, there might still be a gap between us and a perfect understanding of the truth. Hence, this gap of doubt can only exist if we posit an objective understanding that we fall short of. Relativism, on the other hand, does not answer for doubt, but effectively denies it. If truth is relative, there is no standard to fall short of, and no gap between doubt and perfect understanding. If each individual mind is the ultimate measure of truth, there is no truth beyond what the individual mind comprehends, and hence no doubt that needs to be overcome. Thus, doubt is what proves an objective truth about an objective reality, because it is an admission that there is a comprehension of truth that we lack, which goes beyond our personal understanding. Therefore, the arguments from complexity do not prove that truth is ultimately relativistic. Pockets of subjective truth exist. Indeed, there seems to be a subjective element in the mind of every living person. But this is a far cry from the assertion that truth and reality are, therefore, at base, merely relative things. The claim that reality is complex is evident, but it invites us to be more, not less objective in our thinking. It demands that we admit of better and worse standards, and invites us to pursue ideas and values that map onto reality more accurately as opposed to less. In every case, the existence of an objective standard re-emerges, and although relativism might appear to account for the complexity of truth by describing it as something which changes from person to person, we can see that it is in fact an attempt to flee from the question of complexity, abandoning any sense of progress in value or understanding to collapse. It is only an appreciation of objective truth that recognizes standards beyond our preferences that can truly call us to improve, and that calls us to see how truth can be both complex and consistent within one and the same reality. Same truth, different paths, and necessary standards. If what has been said in the previous section can be regarded as a negative case against relativism, some more words should be given in favour of a positive approach towards objective truth in light of what has been said. There is a way to understand objectivism that accounts for a shared truth that can be approached in a variety of ways. Yet, even as we account for this variety, we can recognise that our understanding of truth is anchored in some necessary standards. As we have seen, the truth is complex and can seem different from many perspectives. But aside from the change in perspective, it is true that we can approach truth in a number of different ways. Reality is objective, one thing, one territory, if you like, but it's true that we can take different paths through it. Then again, it's also worth considering that not every path will lead to the same place, and that, no matter what path we take, there will need to be some necessary standards that we set. Returning to a simple, practical example, men can build houses in many different ways. Some build them out of stone, others out of wood, some out of metal, others from glass. But every effort that we make to build houses will be subject to the laws of physics. Whatever material we use to build with, the houses will still require, well, material. This is where we see the objective parameter. But beyond that, it's not as if every approach will produce the same result. A thin wooden house might be easier to build but retain less heat. A stone house might have better heating but less airflow. Glass houses are often hard to build and might feel exposed. And a metal house is difficult to live in if you happen to be sane. In any case, each approach will produce a different result, because the one objective reality is at once completely consistent, all houses are made from material, yet produces different outcomes when we interact with it in different ways. And so, going beyond talk of houses, this idea is important for at least two more considerations: how we can come to know reality, and how we can come to live within it. The goal isn't to lay out a fully fledged morality or a theory of knowledge. Of course, that would be far too much for this book. But the idea is simply to posit a few basic considerations on this theme. To start with, if we are going to know reality, there are a number of different approaches we can take. We can experience it and we can think about it. We can see it for ourselves or learn about it from a friend. We have reason, insight, intuition, and even revelation. All ways of gathering pieces of the puzzle. But the key thing is that these pieces come in different shapes and in different sizes, and they don't all tell us about the same parts of reality in the same way. For example, the information that we gather from our physical senses gives us different kinds of information, different kinds of puzzle pieces, as compared to the exercise of reason. One gives us a kind of raw sense information of things like colour, distance, weight, height, and length, whereas the other can give us a kind of integral or connective form of information that allows us to know that if a green plank of wood is 10 meters long, it is shorter than a 20-meter piece, even before we measure them. Hence, when we want to learn the truth about pieces of wood and their sizes, observation gives us one part of the picture, reason can give us another, and a combination of the two can give us a more complete picture still. Not only that, but these different sources give us access to different parts of reality. By definition, our senses only give us access to parts of reality which are accessible to the senses, or, most broadly conceived, physical reality. That's why physical science, for example, cannot see the spiritual or moral layers of reality, except insofar as these layers might manifest themselves in the physical world in some way. The practical point of importance in all this is that if one thing that we are trying to do is to discover the truth about reality, it helps to be aware of the function and limitations of various approaches. Pure reason might help us to learn much about the nature of things, but it alone might not allow us to build a house. For that, we need to see the world with our senses. Developing the idea further, it's not as if every use of reason or of our senses will be equally accurate or reliable. After all, just because we exercise our reason doesn't mean that we always avoid logical fallacies. We could reason that all monkeys live in the sea because all monkeys are fish, but this is still fallacious. Likewise, a man could believe that rabbits live in hats, that birds fly out of hands, or that bright-eyed, beautiful women will come out smiling after you saw them in half because his senses told him so at the local magic show. Trying to live by these conclusions would quickly slam us into some tricky results. It's for these kinds of reasons that we either intuit different forms of discernment. If a man rubs his hands together with an evil glint in his eye while he's promising you the world, it might not be true. Or, on the other hand, we try to develop formal systems for testing and gathering information, as we do in science, logical reasoning, legal practice, or anywhere else where we want to be more sure about the truth. These will lead to different results. A shoddy version of science will mean that we will fail to make reliable predictions which, by extension, means that we can't plan around them and might flounder in the dark. Likewise, a shoddy model of law could send innocent men into jail cells, and has doubtless sent many to the gallows. Hence, once we admit of objective truth, the need to discern it correctly can't be overstated. Now we get to the idea of necessary standards. Another thing that anchors objectivity as relativism drifts away is the fact that, no matter what approach we take to understanding truth, some necessary standards are in place if anything is to make any sense. These standards relate directly to self-evident truths. Claims such as existence exists, for example, or language conveys meaning are fundamental objective starting points, because if language never conveyed any meaning, these words wouldn't mean anything. And if there was no existence, we wouldn't be here to argue about whether it exists. The full number of genuinely self-evident truths is probably much less than many people think. But genuinely self-evident truths are ones like those mentioned above, or the eminent 2 + 2 = 4, and they are self-evident for the same fundamental reason. And this is why a discussion on necessary standards always brings us back to Aristotle's laws of thought. A more complete treatment was given of these laws in Life and Truth, but just to summarize again, the laws of thought can be fully expressed in any part, even in just the first law, which can be codified by stating that A equals A. This is the law of identity, and in a word, it means that reality is consistent with itself. By extension, everything within reality and everything which is really true abides by consistency. Anytime that we encounter an inconsistency, we know that we have either encountered a falsehood or something is muddled in the process of our own thinking. This is a necessary standard, if not the necessary standard, because it could not be any other way. Reality is reality. If it were not, reality would deny itself and simply would not be. But as reality does happen to exist, it must be consistent, as must every truth within it. Before we close this chapter, it is worth saying something on the subject of morality. Like with any other facet of truth, morality can entail a variety of approaches, but just like with any other facet of truth, it doesn't follow that any given approach is legitimate to the same degree. If we zoom out, each culture might have a different description of, say, the material universe, but it doesn't follow that all of these descriptions are equally accurate or equally practical to work with. Likewise, every culture might have its own approach to morality, which may not be completely unique, but is at least distinct in some way from the other cultures around it. And it does not then follow that despite these differences, all of these approaches to morality are equally accurate or equally true in different ways. As clear as this may seem, it is worth stating because it is the kind of mistake that people so often make when they claim, for example, that all of the religions of the world are basically the same, when the descriptions of reality in each religion, and perhaps more importantly, the descriptions of morality in each religion, are different to the point of being incompatible. Buddhism entails the complete removal of desire. Christianity believes in passionate desire, but for a particular thing, the kingdom of God. Muslims and Christians alike speak of one God, but Christians insist on a submission and worship to Jesus Christ, which doctrinally makes all of the difference. Aside from that, there are a myriad of smaller rules about everything from charity to killing to the rites of marriage that, despite some overlap, entails that a devout Buddhist does not live like a devout Muslim who does not live like a devout Christian. The present claim is not that a particular religion is true. Perhaps one is right and all of the others are false. Perhaps all are false in the end. But whatever the case may be, it is certain that they are not equally true, and do not all teach the same thing. Now, even if they are false, if they teach different things about morality, and if morality is objective, as we have seen, it follows that one religion will be more moral than another. One model of religion, taken as a whole, will be closer to the objective standard of good than another, and hence be a better guide for navigating reality. The thing is that, even if we take religions out of the equation, these facts still apply to cultures in general. Different cultures, with their different moralities, will have different approaches to that morality. And as uncomfortable as it might be for the modern mind to consider, some approaches really must be better than others. The present task isn't to demonstrate the best and most objective morality, only to emphasize that within morality an objective standard must exist, and that different approaches will be better or worse at getting near to it. You might then wonder what, at least, a necessary standard might look like in this part of the inquiry, but at its root, the necessary standard is consistency. Whatever objective morality turns out to be, it will result from the nature of reality and what is good, what our nature is and how we contribute to the good in light of reality and our means to navigate within it. Reality is itself, and that is the first clue to discovering morality. Relativism is the devil's game. The kind of attitude that we seem to hold towards relativism is not only wrong, demonstrably, definitively, and objectively wrong, but it is also evil. The present task is to explain just why that's the case. One way to do that is to imagine a being who wants nothing but what is worst for humanity, and wants to lead us into the most profound suffering and confusion by way of evil. Maybe this being exists, maybe it doesn't, but whatever you may believe, just imagine, if you will, what relativism might seem like from such a being's point of view. Now, one way to perpetrate evil is by doing something very bad for someone whilst convincing them that it's very good. Why? Because that way you can get their guard down, sneak underneath and wreak havoc without anyone knowing it. Better yet, if you sell evil in the form of good, the person may not only let their guard down, but practically invite you in and pour you a cup of tea. That's the kind of exchange that happens between relativism and those individuals and societies who embrace it. It comes in with a smile and the visage of wisdom, promising liberation. It gives us this vague yet striking sense that if we really can recreate truth in our own image, men can be as gods, redefining reality unto ourselves. Yet, just as he always does, the devil coaxes us forward with a lie. And it is the fact that relativism is a lie about what rests at the foundation of our understanding that makes it primed for devastation. With relativism, he tells us that we will be free.
Finally, break free from all tyranny, even the tyranny of reality itself. Why be confined by such limited and regressive ideas, such as logic or quantity or so-called true nature? There is no such thing as objective truth. It is only ideas, perspectives, and opinions, and the more convincing you can make those opinions, to yourselves or to others, the more real they will be. Go then, forget these confines, break these shackles, be free, be true revolutionaries in the utmost degree, revolt, reshape and redefine reality. After all,
He continues in a soft, almost humorous tone,
what's the harm? What's the harm in saying that twice 2 makes 5? It's only one little number. What's the harm in saying that all cultures are the same? Don't they basically seem the same anyway? What's the harm in saying that men are women? After all, they're so similar in many ways. There's only a small difference.
What we don't see at the first suggestion, blinded by such carefree temptation, is where the logic of this offer leads. Indeed, why should there be any difference between men and women? They both have 2 hands and 2 feet. What, after all, is the real difference between men and chickens, because they have but 2 feet? What, after all, is the real difference between honesty and deception, between purity or perversion, or between love and malicious intent? Is it any kind of surprise that this kind of thinking bears tainted fruit? It places women in the same positions as men and men in the same positions as women, creating insoluble conflicts when they find that those who have XY chromosomes outperform all other women in sport, and those with XX chromosomes have the profound, unfair advantage of being the only kind of people who can ever physically give birth. Like jamming a square peg into a round hole, a man will go to great lengths to dress like a woman, sound like a woman, and perhaps even think in some way that he imagines women to think, but all the while is deeply aware, through some rational anchor in his psyche, that he simply isn't a woman. Yet, all the while, the devil holds up the mirror and whispers,
Remember, you can be whatever you want to be.
Finally, it is the same idea that places cultures that have differing traditions and differing values side by side. and once again results in insoluble problems. It would have all people and all ways of life come to live together as if by a wave of opinions we can live the same way. It would have traditional Muslims and homosexuals live in the same area, for example, and discover with perplexed surprise that when those Muslim values reject homosexuality, either the Muslims have to be suppressed in favor of homosexuals, or the homosexuals in favor of Muslims. And as we have seen, the liberal answer is that you can all be different so long as you are not different and all embrace the liberal ideal. It offers the idea of round pegs and square holes, as if each person and culture can readily change their identities to find their fit, only to discover that, at best, there can only be a fit if all become the same misshapen peg to fit one and the same misshapen hole. You see, it's all just a lie, and it is a lie because it does not match reality. It cannot match reality because reality is itself, and being itself, it simply is not relativistic in this way. Through this lie, what the devil really achieves is a severance between reality and our ability to interact with it. After all, if truth accords with reality, and relativism is a fundamental lie about the truth, relativism puts us at fundamental odds with the true way of things. Far from being freed from reality, he leaves us trapped within confusion. If you want to lead a man on a difficult path through a swamp, it is no good saying that he is free as if all roads lead to safety. You have to say that this way leads through a steady road, and this way should be avoided, lest you be pulled down into the pit. It is hatred to such a man to pretend that all paths are practically the same, knowing that so many paths result in death. Because, make no mistake of it, if the devil does exist, he is very clever, and as much as he might whisper that it equals 5, he knows full well that 2 + 2 makes 4. If he really wanted to have his way, the devil wouldn't stop at convincing men to be women, or at convincing politicians that all cultures are the same. No, with ravenous lust he would go on to convince us that there is no difference between enemies and friends, no difference between food or poison, and call all men to throw themselves off of buildings, with the notion that
Falling is simply the purest form of flight.
he already seems to have closed the gap between purity and perversion, and to convince a chunk of our society that greed is good. In the end, he would seek to make us free of all things, including life, love, sense, and morality. Therefore, we find that whether the devil exists or not, if such a being did exist, relativism would be a great and destructive tool for him. In hatred, knowing full well that it would sever men from their mental connection with reality, he would offer the so-called freedoms of relativism as if they were another step towards mankind's great liberation, the kind of which he has been helping them to pursue since the time of the fall. With the promise that man can be free from and ultimate master of reality, he would set man at direct odds with reality, whilst man remains subject to it. Hence, far from being free, man is left trapped within his own insanity and incompetency. Relativism is evil. This is not to say that every person who holds any relativistic ideals is an evil person. That accusation is another serpentine twist. This is to say that relativism is an evil idea, and the more we invite it in, wittingly or not, we are inviting a corrupting element into the mental landscape of our world. Maybe the devil exists, maybe he doesn't. But even if he does exist, he forces us to do nothing. He can only tempt and persuade. Whether the devil exists or not, the responsibility ultimately resides in our hands. It is up to us to decide whether we would dance with this Pied Piper into the shadowed caves of perdition, or stop, stand, think, turn back, and embrace the clear light of day. Truth and humility. Objectivists are so arrogant. Is that claim familiar? Who are you to say what is true or not? The idea, of course, being that if we accept that truth is something relative, that will keep us humble because it will mean that we can never really insist on one particular truth, and, by extension, we'll never be able to say that someone is wrong. Yet, like the lie of liberation sold in the chapter above, the idea that objectivism is prideful and relativism is humble is a lie, and one which is the exact opposite of the truth. The truth is that objectivism requires humility, and that all who seek to understand truth must be humble in their pursuit, in the understanding that there may always be something that we are missing and that they have something to learn. As we discussed above, reality is complex, and the recognition that it is objective and complex means that there is truth beyond our individual comprehension that we may not understand in parts or may fail to grasp in some way. True enough, an objectivist approach can be arrogant if the one who voices it implies that it somehow makes them omniscient. As if stating that 2 + 2 = 4 directly entails that you know the movement of a scrap of atoms somewhere within the asteroid belt of Saturn 1,000 years in the future. Such a man might be a fool in this regard, but 2 and 2 remain 4. Yet a man might be able to make such a minute prediction about atoms orbiting Saturn. It's not beyond the realms of possibility. If the only thing that he knows is that 2 + 2 = 4, the other claim is arrogant. But if he has carried out his investigation thoroughly, he may indeed be able to make such a minute description and effectively map that part of reality. The point being that objectivist claims are arrogant to the extent that they are baseless. But as the foundation of objectivism has already been shown to be irrefutable, objectivism as such is not arrogant, although some objective claims might be. The question is only whether people make objective claims with more or less support. A claim about atoms is one thing, a supported claim about atoms is another, and it is another thing still if the person making their claims is open to correction, is willing to bend to the true scope of complexity if his information is shown to be incomplete or his standards faulty. That is why objectivism is compatible with humility, because, at base, it recognizes that there is a reality beyond us and that our understanding of truth must bend to it. It does not simply bend to us. Relativism, on the other hand, is anathema to humility. It fundamentally rests upon the idea that reality is something that bends to us, that it is formed by our dictate, which we make in our own image. For that reason, it is relativism, not objectivism, that represents the heights of pride. Just consider the level of pride needed to think that reality is something that is shaped under your terms. Every sane person not only does, but must recognize that even if we are to leave our own mark on reality and shape some part of it to our own preference, we do so through an existence of cooperation or compromise as opposed to dictatorship. We can build rocks into a house to shelter us from the rain, but we cannot demand that those same heavy rocks be as light as feathers, nor can we demand that the rain cease forever. These are facts of life that we must work within in order to live accordingly. Here is another thing to consider. That objectivism may seem to be arrogant because objective truth does assert some kind of pull. When someone makes claims about objective truth, they are making assertions about a reality that they are subject to, just as everyone else is. If the man is wrong, there is hardly anything to consider. But if the man is right, it means that he is describing things that apply to everyone, even if some would prefer such things to be untrue. That might also be why relativists are less likely to disagree with objectivism when objective claims happen to agree with their preferences. In that sense, it may not be the objective part that is the problem, but only the parts of objectivism that disagree with one's mental state. If, for example, a man states that it is a universal fact that water is wet, no one may seem to care, but say that God exists and things start to get a bit heated. This is because everyone knows, at least implicitly, that if God exists, that fact does not stand relegated to some obscure or irrelevant corner of fact. If the capital G God exists and presides over the universe, this is a universal truth which applies to everyone. Everyone is involved with this fact, or we might say, this fact is involved in them. It entails a reframing of reality, a reframing of belief, and, by extension, perhaps even a strong reconsideration about one's decisions, life choices, and values. The point is not that God exists. The claim that God does not exist, if made objectively, holds sway over the very same considerations. The point is that just such claims as these tell us about a reality which is not confined to our desires. And although that reality may be beautiful, profoundly beautiful in many ways, it may well pull us to see something that we do not otherwise want to see. If God does in fact exist, with all that this entails, many people would rather break truth into 1,000 pieces. Hence, the idea that God exists might be permitted in 1,000 different ways, just so long as we do not accept that it is true objectively. The final rub with this issue about the accusation of arrogance is when people accuse a person who makes objective claims of trying to constrain them, as if that person is the author of that same reality that they are trying to describe. If an eternal God does indeed exist, it follows that he does so independently of any person's claims. The objective fact would be that he exists and keeps on existing, even if a single man never called upon his name. If, then, a man does claim that God exists, he is pointing to a truth which is beyond himself. It's as if a man could look out of the window and say, "It is raining," and then be reprimanded for causing the rain. Yet notice that this power that the man is being accused of is that same power that relativism actually claims to possess. It might be called projection, or at least is analogous to it. If a man says that it is raining, you can only blame him for the rain if you think that the powers of recognizing and creating are one and the same thing. But an objectivist doesn't hold this belief. This is a relativist claim. Hence, by assuming the relativist principles, a relativist might accuse an objectivist of trying to tyrannize them with reality, whilst objectivism itself doesn't hold that reality is shaped that way. And so, if objectivism seems arrogant, remember that this arrogance is counterposed by the profound, genuine arrogance of relativism. Objectivist claims might seem arrogant because they appeal with some confidence to a fixed and shared reality, and hence point to something beyond each person which applies to all, which may well exert some demand, whether morally or intellectually. But note that if anything asserts some kind of pull, it is reality itself that does this, not the finger that is pointing to it. An objectivist worldview can be called arrogant if its proponents claim more than they are able, but at base it is humble because it entails a continual bending towards the shape of reality, and men are called arrogant when they don't bend to this shape, when that is what the truth seems to demand. Relativists, on the other hand, bend to nothing, but would have everything bend to themselves. Relativists do not hold that we are things that need to fit into reality, but that reality is something that must find a special shape to fit into each one of us. And so being the standards of truth and reality has us fancy that we become gods unto ourselves. Humility is important for truth because humility is what leaves us open to find truth, and in its pride, relativism will leave our eyes blind to the truth. Humility is so important because it accepts the smallness of our own understanding as compared to the full scope of truth that we fall short of, which motivates us to improve. With pride, there is no need to learn, because our opinions are the extent of thought, and there is nothing left to improve. The Battleground of Language. When stripped down to raw logic, the primacy of objectivism over relativism is directly evident. But alas, when we wrestle with these subjects from day to day, they get swept up in the melange of our language, where so much misapprehension has room to fester. That is not because language is illogical. It is not that natural language is ultimately inferior to formal logic, because it isn't. It is because the general ambiguities and nuances of natural language are open to abuse and leave pools of misunderstanding exposed within which confusion is allowed to mutate. Much of the support for the claim that truth is ultimately relativistic relies on shifting uses of language, either that or a misapprehension of how language functions. For example, a relativist might say that men are women, and say that this is true because someone with an XX chromosome who was previously called a woman is now called a man, and therefore now is a man. Yet, as we evidently see, even as the label changes, the core natural features remain the same. The woman is no more able to be a man than she is able to fly if she calls herself a bird. Hence, this is where we begin. Insofar as words are used as labels, the change of the label does not change the reality of the thing that they are labeling. Yet, this is where it gets tricky, especially as we are using language to discuss language. Unless this kind of sophistry is dismissed out of hand, it forces us to divert and take the same issue from a different angle. Why? Well, consider, let's say that the whole of society replaces the word man for woman. The labels are completely switched. Now, if we take someone with an XX chromosome and ask, is this a man? The true answer would be yes. Aha! The relativist might say. See, it is true that this is a man when it used to be true that this is a woman. We have changed the truth by changing the word, and therefore we can use language to change the nature of reality. This is sophistry at work, and let's take a closer look at what it entails. Now that the language has changed, it appears to be true that people with XX chromosomes are men. But this truth describes what? The kind of person who was described by the word before it was changed? We now call someone with XX chromosomes a man, but is this a person with male genetics, male features, and male reproductive organs? No. Then what reality is this truth describing? It is describing the same truth, the same underlying reality that sits beneath the labels. Therefore, the truth has remained objective. It really is only the words that have changed. This example is also given whilst implying that language is flexible in this way, as if the whole of society could overturn a definition all at once. The nuanced issue here is that the meaning of words are indeed subject to change, but this doesn't relativize language because certain underlying conditions are at play. Given what happens with the example above, there is the general idea that because the natures underlying our words remain consistent, the definitions of those words ought to remain consistent too, with the implied recognition that if we change our definitions on a whim, we don't change reality, we just make it harder to think about it clearly. However, words may be more than labels, and a given word may have a different meaning based on context and intention. Indeed, if we look at a word in a dictionary, we see a list of the different intentions that can be connected to a word to produce its meaning. And if we study etymology, we can see how the relationship between the formation of a word and the intention attached to its meaning has developed over time. Therefore, it would appear that, in this sense, the meaning of language is relative to time, intention, and context. Yet, language is constrained by a crucial parameter, which is this: convention. If language conveys meaning, it must allow for consistent meaning to be conveyed between people, so they can exchange meaning effectively. Even if language were confined to the mind of an individual, it would need to convey meaning consistently in order for it to be useful. Imagine, for example, that a man lived on a desert island and started to invent his own language so that he could think about the things on the island, like beach, or sand, or food, or trees, so that he could think, the sand is on the beach, or the food is in the trees, and so on. Now, the man would quickly get himself into a muddle if each day he swapped out the words and replaced sand with trees, concluding that the food is in the sand. The issue is not so much the choice of words. He may have called them anything. The point is that it is the change of words, and therefore the reorganization of meaning, that causes the confusion. That is possible with one man, but consider how that applies to a whole society. One man says, "Pass me that cup," and the other knows what to do because he trusts the shared meaning of words like pass and cup. If the man who was told to "pass me that cup" suddenly took that as a command to stand on his head, we would perceive that there had been some horrible break in communication. And if one man defined cup in one unique way and the next man defined it in another, the whole social utility of the word cup would lose all meaning, and no one would dare try to open another bar or cafe. In a word, despite its fluidity, language requires consistency to the extent that men need to have an exchange of meaning. Half of the beauty of language is that it is flexible enough to allow for jokes and poetry and nuance, and the other half of its beauty rests in the fact that it is reliable, that when one man meets a stranger in his native tongue, if the intention is clear, he can say with confidence, "hello," and expect it to be received as a greeting. And so the key thing is this: shared language and shared definitions allow for a shared and consistent exchange of meaning. This need not be completely static, and indeed it isn't. But as languages develop and change, slowly, we trust that the people around us understand the words that we are trying to use at any given moment, our intentions and the meaning that we are trying to convey. In a word, a consistent language allows us to continue being a part of the same conversation. It is conceivable that individuals or societies could break away and redefine the use of the words of the English language in completely unique ways. But what would this mean? It would mean that when such people came together, they would be having different conversations. They would not be talking to, but past each other, exchanging the same sounds but not the same meaning. Therefore, think about what that does to the issue of discourse and the discernment of truth. When two men are discussing the truth, it is crucial that they work within the parameters of the same language. Otherwise, truth claims and refutations alike might be working at cross purposes. If a man says that the moon is made of cheese, you can only disagree with him if you both mean the same thing by cheese. If his understanding of cheese is what you understand to mean rock, then there may be no disagreement, even if there may well seem to be. Likewise, if you say the moon is made of rock, but the other's understanding of rock is what you consider to mean cheese, there might be the appearance of agreement, when in fact there isn't. Two men trying to pursue truth together must try their best to use the same language. If a third man comes in with a completely different language, this is an implicit admission that he has no place in the discussion. However, the greatest problem arises when one person gives the impression that they are using the same language, when in fact they are trying to do something subtly different, especially under pretense. That's what the trick of redefining woman really is. It's an attempt to create a parallel language and then tuck it into the flow of ordinary speech. It is an imposter language. This is very distinct from technical language, which juts out from language as a kind of backroad or country lane, content to say, for example, that within the laboratories of science, chemistry only ever means the relation of chemicals and never the relation between people, because honest people who use technical language know that the meaning of their terms give way to different definitions when they return to the center of normal conversation. The redefinition of woman, on the other hand, is like a term cooked up in a mad laboratory experiment, which should have remained locked up in a musty cellar, but instead has been paraded with banners down the main thoroughfare of the city. All the while, as this strange abomination tries to strut where it doesn't belong, the original meaning of the word looks on in perplexity. It is for all these reasons that we can finally understand why language is a battleground for truth. The struggle over what words we can say and how we can use them is a struggle over what words can mean and the kind of conversations that we can have. It is quite literally conventional warfare, because it is a war over convention. The conventions that are defended or formed will then determine the landscape of discourse. Remember, it is not the landscape of truth itself that changes, but only the landscape of meaningful exchange, and our ability to think about the truth and to engage in its pursuit will be both broadened and bottlenecked, helped and hampered by the strength, scope, and consistency of our language. What's more, it is a conflict of saboteurs as much as a conflict of convention, and whilst most of us can march forward, confident that there is slight shifting yet stable ground beneath our feet, there are those who might seek to set traps along the path, or to blow the train right off of its tracks. Truth is a shield. Why does truth matter? There are a million reasons, but in one way we can say that the truth matters because it is a shield. It is a shield against falsehood, which is either a blind fog which makes us slip into the pitfalls of life, or it is a pernicious enemy actively trying to drag us down. We can consider why civilized men are so universally opposed to lies, at least from those who we love. We value honesty from the people around us because, whatever men may call themselves, we all intuitively recognize that lies bar our access to reality. And if we cannot access reality, we cannot live accordingly. Yet lies can come from many places, from society at large, from people around us, or maybe most often, from ourselves. We can either deceive ourselves or close ourselves off from the influence of truth out of some lust for comfort or out of fear. The irony of this is that this makes the situation worse. Many people might say, for example, that beyond the most immediate need, They would rather not explore truth because they don't know what they might find, with the sneaking suspicion that the truth that they might discover about reality is something best left unseen. Yet, as we have shown, despite what any relativist might say, just as reality doesn't change its nature based on our considerations, it doesn't stop existing if we choose not to consider it. And all of the hidden dangers of reality do not stop being dangerous, even if they remain hidden. We can picture a man sat at home after a long week of work with his shoes off, feet up, beer in hand, and a few slices of pizza. As he drifts into his leisure, a vague crackling can be heard from the other room. A slight smell of smoke comes wafting in through the curtain that separates his kitchen from view. Now, as the heat begins to rise and the smell becomes sharper, the man begins to feel the thud of footsteps, and even a low, rumbling roar. Yet, as every implication of these signs strikes his imagination, the man slaps them down because he's just settling into watching his favourite show. His life is so much easier if he has no problems, and so better to ignore these signs because he knows that problems don't exist if you ignore them, and the signs will eventually go away. Alas, the man never fully relaxes into his chair, and never really settles into a fully ignorant bliss. And all the while that he suppresses his attention, something grows and grows. Until suddenly the curtain is blown open and the whole room is set ablaze, and when he looks to the kitchen he sees that there was a dragon behind the curtain all along, striding forth with hungry eyes and firm, gritted teeth. The man chose to live in a lie, and now the dragon will feed. But if the man had chosen truth, it may have been a shield. By accepting his plight, despite the obvious discomfort, he might have charged into the kitchen and slain the dragon before it had time to get to its feet. Or if this could not be, the truth may have at least shielded him to give him time to flee before the dragon could burn down his whole world, with him still in it. Hence, truth is a shield because it saves us from the hidden dragons of the lie. If you go to buy some food and the label says that it is perfectly healthy when in fact it is full of poison, that is a dragon. If you invest all of your money into a bank, when the bankers know full well that it is going to collapse and they will be able to run off with your money, that is a dragon. And if a woman is promising you full fidelity so that she can one day become your wife, when in fact she spends all of her spare time in the arms of other men, that is a dragon. And as difficult as it might be to find new food, to safeguard your money, or to find a new woman, it is all the more difficult to gorge on poison, lose all of your money, and sign a lifelong contract with betrayal. Truth is a shield, and it secures us in reality so that we may march through it in the best way that we can. Truth is a sword. Finally, truth is a sword. It is a sword because it strikes out against lies and distortions, and it divides. It severs between what is true and what is false. This is perhaps the last great charge against objective truth, that if we accept it, we create grounds for conflict. As a criticism, this is nonsense. Not because it is untrue, but because the conflict exists anyway, whether we like it or not. The conflict between truth and falsehood is fundamental. Once we say that 2 + 2 = 4, we say that it does not equal 5. Once we say that virtue is good, we say that vice is evil. All truth claims divide themselves from what is false. Relativism is also conflict. Far from uniting anyone, it atomizes the minds of men and leaves them scattered as so many islands in a storm. It is a truer road to chaos. Objectivism also entails conflict, but far from calling for chaos, a recognition of objective truth calls all men together to recognize it and to fight for it. This book has shown that objective truth is undeniable. Its clash with falsehood is inevitable. If we stay on the side of falsehood, we render ourselves lost, confused, unable to find our way within reality, and impotent to fully serve the good. If we want to remain merely neutral, the great course of reality sweeps us along with it, for good or for ill, in our grey, passive ignorance. Therefore, once you know that the conflict exists, better to choose a side. And so, it may as well be the only side that is worth choosing. Truth is pro-reality. It is in favour of dealing with existence as it is, and is willing to accept reality on its own terms. Not that this means that reality is perfect. Nothing about a recognition of objective truth entails that reality is merely static or unchangeable, or that it cannot, if not must, be improved. But the really key thing is that if reality is to be changed for the better, it can only be changed on its own terms. Trying to improve things by pursuing falsehoods is as practical as existing in non-existence, and will, at best, allow us to stumble upon improvements by accident, although in all other cases it will only make things worse. And so, truth is a sword, and a sword we must wield against the degradations of lies in order to make life better. But it is a sword that must be held with humility, because it is so much greater than we are. And if we encounter truth that cuts through the falsehoods of our own lives, we too should bow down with humility and let its work be done upon us. After all, if we live by truth and favour reality, reality is ultimately on our side.